Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This is not the story you think it is. This is not a story about getting high, about counterculture rebellion, about tie-dye and music festivals and youthful experimentation. This is not about recreational use or personal choice or individual freedom, though all of those threads are woven into the fabric of what we're about to explore. This is the story of how a plant that human beings cultivated, used, and depended upon for more than 10,000 years became the justification for the largest, longest, and most devastating criminal justice campaign in modern history. This is a story about power, about control, about fear weaponized and deployed against communities, against dissent, against people who dared to exist outside the boundaries of what those in power deemed acceptable. The numbers are staggering. Over the past 50 years, more than 26 million Americans have been arrested for marijuana-related offenses. 26 million. That's more than the entire population of Australia. Billions of dollars spent, tens of thousands of lives lost in cartel violence fueled by prohibition, entire communities devastated by mass incarceration, families torn apart, futures erased. All over a plant that kills no one, a plant that was in every pharmacy in America a century ago, a plant that built the British Empire's navy, that was woven into the very fabric of American independence, that was prescribed by doctors and used by grandmothers and considered as ordinary as aspirin. And then in the span of a few decades, it became public enemy number one. Before we go any further, if you're finding value in this deep dive into buried history, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and it helps me understand this community we're building together. What you're about to hear is not sensationalism. It's not conspiracy theory. Every fact, every date, every name has been researched and verified. This is documentary history, the kind that doesn't make it into high school textbooks because it asks uncomfortable questions about power, about justice, about who gets to decide what's criminal and what's commerce. This is a story that spans continents and millennia. It begins in the ancient world, in the hands of Neolithic farmers who discovered a gift from the earth itself. It travels through empires and eras, through medicine and industry, through spirituality and science. And then it crashes headlong into the 20th century, where racism, political ambition, corporate interest, and moral panic converged to create a war that is still being fought, a war with real casualties, real prisoners, real blood. So here's what I'm asking. Turn off your phone, or at least silence the notifications. Get comfortable. Let the day drain away. This is going to take some time, and it's going to go to places that might surprise you, might anger you, might leave you with more questions than answers. But that's the point. History isn't neat. It doesn't resolve cleanly. The best we can do is bear witness, understand what happened, and ask ourselves what we're going to do with that knowledge. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was no marijuana. There was only hemp, and human survival depended on it. A tall, fibrous plant with serrated leaves and a distinctive jagged silhouette that could grow almost anywhere humans chose to settle. Its origins are lost in the mists of deep time, somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, in the region we now call the Tibetan Plateau, perhaps extending into what is modern-day Mongolia. This was harsh territory, high altitude, extreme temperatures, unforgiving terrain. The plants that survived there had to be resilient, adaptable, extraordinarily strong. Cannabis was all of those things. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans and cannabis have been partners for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. This timeline places cannabis domestication in the Neolithic period, that revolutionary era when humans transitioned from nomadic hunting and gathering to settle agriculture. This was not a partnership born of intoxication or recreation or spiritual seeking, though those dimensions would come later. This was a partnership born of pure, practical necessity. The ancient peoples of the Neolithic age, those first farmers who abandoned the wandering life and began to shape the earth to their will, quickly discovered that this plant was a gift. Hemp fiber was among the strongest natural materials they had ever encountered. When the stalks were stripped, the outer layer removed, the inner fiber separated, dried, and twisted into cordage, the resulting rope could bear enormous weight without breaking. It could withstand moisture, resist rot, endure the elements in ways that other plant fibers simply could not. This was survival technology. Hemp rope meant better fishing nets, which meant more reliable food. It meant the ability to secure shelters against wind and storm. It meant the capacity to bind tools, to create more complex structures, to pull heavier loads. In a world where every resource mattered, where a broken rope could mean starvation or death from exposure, hemp was invaluable. The fibers could also be woven into fabric. Cloth made from hemp was durable, breathable, and remarkably long-lasting. It clothed bodies, it became sails, it provided the raw material for shelter and storage.
In archaeological sites across Central Asia, researchers have found impressions of hemp rope and fabric preserved in ancient pottery, dated to as far back as 8,000 BCE. These are not myths or legends. These are physical remnants of a partnership that predates written language, predates recorded history. As human civilization spread, as populations migrated and trade networks began to form, cannabis traveled with them. By the 3rd millennium BCE, it had reached China, where it would become woven into the cultural and medical fabric of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. In 2737 BCE, according to Chinese tradition, the Emperor Shennong, a semi-mythical figure credited with teaching agriculture and herbal medicine to the Chinese people, compiled a pharmacopoeia that included cannabis. Whether Shennong was a historical figure or a composite of many ancient healers and leaders, the text attributed to him, the Shennong Benchao Jing, is one of the oldest pharmacological records in existence. In it, cannabis is prescribed for a wide range of ailments: gout, rheumatism, malaria, absent-mindedness, and what we might today call general pain relief. This was medicine, not recreation, not vice, medicine. The ancient Chinese called cannabis ma, and they cultivated it extensively. They understood that different parts of the plant had different uses. The seeds were nutritious, a source of oil and protein. The fibers were industrial, used in textiles and construction. And the flowers, the resinous buds, had medicinal properties that could ease suffering and promote healing. Then, in 105 CE, during the Han Dynasty, a court official named Kai Lun made a discovery that would change the course of human history. He invented paper, and the primary material he used was hemp fiber. Before paper, knowledge was inscribed on bamboo strips, heavy and cumbersome, or on silk, expensive and reserved for the elite. Paper made from hemp was light, durable, and relatively inexpensive to produce. It democratized information. It made books possible, made the spread of ideas feasible on a scale never before imagined. The written word could travel farther, reach more people, preserve itself across generations. Hemp paper revolutionized civilization. In 2003, archaeologists excavating the Yanghai tombs in northwestern China made a remarkable discovery. In a 2,700-year-old grave, they found nearly 2 pounds of cannabis, still green, carefully placed beside the body of a shaman. Chemical analysis confirmed it was high in psychoactive compounds. This was not industrial hemp. This was cannabis cultivated for its medicinal or spiritual properties, valued enough to accompany a revered individual into the afterlife. For these ancient peoples, there was no stigma, no moral panic, no fear. Cannabis was a tool, a resource, a partner in the great project of human survival and flourishing. It was as ordinary and essential as wheat, as barley, as any other cultivated plant. But in the tents of nomadic warriors, cannabis revealed another face entirely. The Scythians were a fierce nomadic people who dominated the Eurasian steppes from roughly the 9th century BCE until the 1st century CE. They were horsemen, warriors, masters of mounted archery and lightning raids. They left no written records of their own, but their neighbors wrote about them, and what they wrote was a mixture of fear, fascination, and bewilderment. In 440 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, recorded something extraordinary in his work known simply as the Histories. He described a Scythian funeral ritual that offers us the first detailed Western account of cannabis used not for fiber or food, but for its psychoactive properties. When a Scythian of importance died, Herodotus wrote, the mourners would construct a small tent using woolen felt stretched over wooden poles. Inside this tent, they would place a vessel containing heated stones, red hot from the fire. Then they would take hemp seeds, crawl into the tent, and throw the seeds onto the glowing stones. What happened next, Herodotus observed with the careful detachment of an anthropology studying a foreign culture, was that the seeds would begin to smoke, producing a vapor so thick and powerful that no Greek vapor bath could surpass it. And the Scythians, seated in this
enclosed space, breathing deeply of the aromatic smoke, would howl with pleasure. Howl with pleasure. This was not recreation in the modern sense. This was not a party, not escapism, not youthful experimentation. This was sacred mourning. This was communion with the dead. The Scythians believed that the smoke opened a doorway, that in the altered state it produced, they could reach across the boundary between the living and the ancestors, could honor the departed, could touch something transcendent and holy. The ritual was so important, so central to their spiritual life, that when Scythian nobles were buried, they were often interred with the tools of this practice. Archaeologists excavating Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, have found bronze cauldrons, bags of cannabis seeds, and even elaborate censers designed specifically for burning hemp.
These were not accidental inclusions. They were deliberate, essential grave goods, as important as weapons or jewelry. While the Scythians were using cannabis in the frozen steppes, far to the south and east, in the Indian subcontinent, the plant was being woven into the very fabric of religious and spiritual life. In Hindu tradition, cannabis is intimately connected with the god Shiva, one of the principal deities, known as the destroyer and transformer. According to legend, Shiva consumed cannabis to focus his mind during deep meditation, to transcend the distractions of the material world and achieve spiritual clarity. To this day, in certain Hindu traditions, cannabis is offered to Shiva in temples, and consuming it is seen not as vice but as sacrament. The preparation known as bhang is perhaps the most enduring form of this tradition. Bhang is a drink made by grinding cannabis leaves and flowers into a paste, then mixing it with milk, honey, butter, and spices like cardamom and saffron. The result is a thick, sweet beverage that is consumed during religious festivals, most notably during Holi, the festival of colors, and Maha Shivaratri, the great night of Shiva. This is not underground, this is not illegal. Even today, in modern India, bhang remains legal and is sold openly during these festivals. It is understood not as a drug, not as an intoxicant in the Western sense, but as a religious tool, a doorway to transcendence, a means of honoring the divine. Cannabis also became a cornerstone of Ayurvedic medicine, the traditional Indian system of healing that dates back thousands of years. Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as a treatment for anxiety, insomnia, pain, digestive issues, and even as an aphrodisiac. Physicians prescribed it. Healers cultivated it. It was as ordinary and accepted as turmeric with ginger. What becomes clear when we look at these ancient cultures, from the Scythians to the Hindus, from China to Central Asia, is that for millennia, cannabis occupied a place in human society that was complex, multifaceted, and deeply integrated. It was fiber and food and medicine and sacrament. It was practical and spiritual, mundane and transcendent. And crucially, it carried no stigma, no moral panic, no one was arrested, no one was demonized. The plant was understood within its cultural context, used with intention and reverence, woven into the rhythms of life and death, celebration and mourning, healing and worship. The criminalization, the fear, the war on drugs, all of that is modern, all of that is recent. For the vast majority of human history, cannabis was simply part of the world, part of the toolkit of survival and meaning-making that our ancestors built over thousands of generations. While the East embraced the plant's sacred dimensions, the West built its empires on hemp's brewed strength. But everything changed when Madison discovered cannabis's hidden chemical power. Or rather, everything was about to change, but first, the plant would build an empire. The Age of Sail, the great wooden ships that would carry European civilization across the oceans, that would connect continents and reshape the world order, that would build empires upon which the sun never set. These ships, these magnificent vessels with their towering masts and billowing sails, were built on hemp, literally. Without cannabis, there would have been no age of exploration, no colonial expansion, no British Empire, no New World. Consider the scale. A single British Royal Navy warship in the 1700s required between 60 and 80 tons of hemp. Tons, not pounds, tons. 50 miles of rope, from the thinnest rigging line to the massive anchor cables as thick as an ant. Every rope, every cable, every line that held the masts upright and controlled the sails was made from hemp fiber. There was no substitute. Hemp rope was stronger, more flexible, and more resistant to salt water than any other natural fiber. Flax rotted, cotton weakened when wet. Only hemp could withstand the constant abuse of ocean spray, tropical heat, and Arctic cold. And then there were the
sails themselves. Here's something worth noting. The word canvas, the very word we use for the fabric of painting and art, comes directly from cannabis. Canvas is cannabis. The great sails that caught the wind and drove ships across uncharted waters were woven from hemp fiber, thousands of square feet of it per ship. When those sails unfurled and filled with wind, when explorers like Magellan and Cook and Columbus pushed into the unknown, they did so on wings of cannabis. The British understood this better than anyone. Hemp was not merely useful, it was strategic, it was existential. In 1533, King Henry VIII mandated that for every 60 acres of land a farmer owned, 1/4 acre must be dedicated to hemp cultivation. This was law. This was national security. Because without hemp, there was no navy, and without a navy, there was no England. The American colonies inherited this understanding. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly passed a law requiring every farmer to grow hemp. Required. This was not a suggestion or an economic incentive. It was legal obligation. Connecticut followed in 1637, Massachusetts, Maryland. Farmers who refused could be fined or jailed. The colonial governments needed hemp for rope, for fabric, for paper. They needed it so desperately that cultivation became civic duty, woven into the legal fabric of early America. And the Founding Fathers understood. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. This is documented in his agricultural diaries, entries written in his own hand detailing planting schedules and harvest yields. He grew it for fiber, for rope, for textiles. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello and called it a crop of first necessity to the wealth and protection of the country. First necessity, not optional, not recreational, essential to the survival of the young nation. Benjamin Franklin built one of America's first paper mills in the 1690s. It processed hemp. Most paper in colonial America came from hemp fiber. It was cheaper than linen rag, more abundant, and produced a durable, long-lasting sheet. When the Continental Congress needed paper for the documents that would declare independence and establish a new form of government, they turned to hemp. The Declaration of Independence, that sacred text of American liberty, was drafted on hemp paper. Early drafts of the Constitution were written on hemp paper. The founding documents of the United States, the philosophical architecture of democracy itself, were inscribed on fibers of cannabis. There was no stigma, no moral panic, no concern about corruption of youth or social decay. Hemp was as American as wheat or corn. It was patriotic. It was practical. It was everywhere. Farmers grew it, mills processed it, ships carried it. The economy ran on it. From the sails that brought European settlers to American shores, to the ropes that built their homes, to the paper that recorded their laws, cannabis was the silent partner in the construction of Western civilization's greatest experiment. The irony is almost unbearable. The plant that was legally mandatory in 1619 would be federally criminalized in 1937. The crop that George Washington cultivated would become grounds for arrest, imprisonment, and the destruction of millions of lives. The fiber that built the British Empire and clothed the American Revolution would be demonized, banned, and erased from the historical record. Children would be taught that cannabis was dangerous, foreign, un-American, never knowing that their nation was built on fields of it. But that transformation, that demonization, was still centuries away. In the age of sale, cannabis was just a plant, a useful plant, a necessary plant, the plant that made empires possible. Then came the physicians, and with them a new chapter, a chapter of medicine, of pharmacology, of chemical discovery. The plant that had clothed and connected the world was about to reveal its hidden properties, the compounds locked within its leaves and flowers that could alter consciousness, relieve pain, and ignite a controversy that would burn for generations. The year was 1839. The place was Calcutta, India. An Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, working for the British East India Company, was about to change Western medicine forever. O'Shaughnessy was a man of science, trained in Edinburgh, skeptical by nature, devoted to observation and evidence. He had been sent to India to study tropical diseases, but what captured his attention was something the local physicians had known for centuries. They were using cannabis as medicine, for pain, for spasms, for convulsions, for a dozen different ailments, and it seemed to work. O'Shaughnessy did what any good scientist would do. He experimented. He tested cannabis extracts on animals first, carefully documenting dosages and effects. Then, with proper consent, he began treating human patients, a child suffering from convulsions, a man racked with rheumatic pain.
Another with tetanus, his muscles locked in agonizing spasm. He prepared tinctures, carefully measured extracts dissolved in alcohol, and administered them under controlled conditions. The results were remarkable. Muscle spasms relaxed, pain diminished, seizures stopped, patients slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. In 1839, O'Shaughnessy published his findings in medical journals that would be read across Europe and America. His paper was meticulous, scientific, undeniable. Cannabis, he argued, was a powerful therapeutic agent that Western medicine had overlooked. He brought samples back to England, distributed them to physicians and pharmacists, and demonstrated the preparation of medical tinctures. Within a decade, cannabis had entered the British pharmacopoeia. Within 2 decades, it had crossed the Atlantic. In 1850, cannabis was officially added to the United States Pharmacopoeia, the authoritative compendium of medical drugs. This was not fringe medicine. This was mainstream, establishment, orthodox medical practice. Cannabis tinctures appeared on pharmacy shelves next to laudanum and quinine. Physicians prescribed it for an extraordinary range of conditions: migraines, insomnia, pain of all kinds, muscle spasms, epileptic seizures, menstrual cramps. It was considered safe, effective, and non-addictive, especially compared to the opiates that were already creating problems of dependence and overdose. The pharmaceutical companies of the era, the giants whose names we still recognize today, manufactured cannabis medicines. Park Davis produced standardized cannabis extracts. Eli Lilly sold cannabis tinctures. Squibb, which would later become part of Bristol-Myers Squibb, offered multiple cannabis preparations. These were not underground operations or folk remedies. These were respected pharmaceutical firms selling government-approved medicines to doctors and patients across America and Europe. You could buy cannabis medicine without a prescription, walk into any pharmacy and purchase Grimalt's Indian cigarettes, which were marketed for asthma and breathing difficulties. The package instructions recommended smoking them to relax the airways. No stigma, no suspicion, just medicine. The advertisements appeared in medical journals and newspapers, touting the therapeutic benefits with the same sober professionalism used to sell cough syrup or headache powder. Even royalty used cannabis medicine. Queen Victoria of England, the monarch who gave her name to an entire era of propriety and moral rectitude, was prescribed cannabis tincture by her royal physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds. She used it for menstrual cramps. Reynolds, one of the most respected physicians in Britain, later wrote that cannabis was one of the most valuable medicines we possess. He prescribed it for over 30 years and saw no reason for concern. No addiction, no moral decay, just relief. This is important to understand. For nearly a century, from the 1840s through the 1930s, cannabis was simply another tool in the medical kit. It sat on pharmacy shelves alongside aspirin and iodine. Doctors prescribed it, patients used it. Pharmaceutical companies manufactured it to exacting standards. There was no panic, no prohibition, no cultural anxiety about its use. It was medicine, understood within the framework of professional medical practice, and regulated by the same authorities that oversaw all other drugs. But that world, that rational, scientific world where cannabis was just another medicine, was about to end. The social forces that would transform cannabis from remedy to menace were already gathering. Alcohol prohibition was coming, that great failed experiment in legislating morality. And when alcohol prohibition collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility, the machinery of enforcement would need a new target, the agents would need a new enemy, the narrative of dangerous intoxicants would need a new villain. The plant itself hadn't changed, the chemistry was the same, the effects were the same, but the story was about to change. And in America, stories have power. Stories can transform medicine into poison, can turn farmers into criminals, can take a plant that had been cultivated for 10,000 years and declare it a threat to civilization itself. Then came the refugees fleeing revolution, and they brought a new word with them, a word that would change everything. The Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910, a violent upheaval that would rage for a decade and claim over 1 million lives. Political chaos, military coups, land wars between peasants and hacienda owners, the collapse of social order. Thousands of Mexican families fled north across the border into the United States, seeking safety, seeking work, seeking survival. They settled in Texas border towns and California agricultural valleys, in the mining camps of Arizona and New Mexico. They brought their language, their culture, their customs, and they brought
their traditional use of a plant they called marijuana. Marijuana, not cannabis, not the hemp that American farmers had been growing for 3 centuries, not the cannabis extract that sat in American pharmacies, prescribed by American doctors. A foreign word, a Spanish word, a Mexican word. This distinction would prove catastrophic. Most Americans had never heard this word before. They knew cannabis, the medicine. They knew hemp, the industrial crop. But marijuana was something different, something strange, something foreign. And in the early 20th century, in a United States already thick with nativism and racial anxiety, foreign meant dangerous. The propaganda began almost immediately. Newspapers in Texas and California began running stories about this Mexican menace, this loco weed that made men violent and uncontrollable. The stories were lurid, sensational, designed to provoke fear. Mexican men smoking marijuana and assaulting white women. Mexican laborers becoming crazed and dangerous under its influence. The drug that made peaceful farmers into murderers. None of this was supported by evidence. None of it was true. But truth was not the point. Fear was the point. William Randolph Hearst controlled the largest newspaper empire in America. His papers reached millions of readers daily, shaping public opinion with the same care that a sculptor shapes clay. And Hearst had reasons, both personal and financial, to demonize cannabis. His massive timber holdings in Mexico had been seized during the Revolution. He hated Mexicans. He hated Mexican culture. And hemp, that cannabis fiber that made cheap, durable paper, was a direct competitor to his wood pulp paper industry. The convergence was perfect. Racism and profit, ideology and economics, personal vendetta and market protection all pointed in the same direction. The Hearst papers ran headlines that make the stomach turn. Murder weed found in slum district. Mexican family goes insane. The stories invented atrocities, fabricated crimes, created a mythology of cannabis-induced violence that had no basis in medical literature or criminal statistics. But perhaps most revealing, most nakedly racist, were the quotes attributed to officials and experts in these articles. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. Marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. These were not fringe opinions buried in letters to the editor. These were the stated justifications for prohibition, printed in major newspapers, offered as scientific fact. In 1915, El Paso, Texas became the first American city to ban marijuana. The law was explicit in its target. It was designed to control and criminalize the Mexican population, to give police a legal tool for harassment and deportation. If you couldn't arrest someone for being Mexican, you could arrest them for possessing marijuana. The effect was the same. This was not drug policy. This was racial policy dressed in the language of public health. But there was another force at work, quieter but equally powerful: industrial competition. The DuPont Chemical Company had just patented a new synthetic fiber called nylon. DuPont had also developed new chemical processes for making paper from wood pulp. Both innovations required massive capital investment, new factories, new supply chains. Both were threatened by hemp, which could produce stronger textiles and cheaper paper using existing agricultural infrastructure. DuPont's main financial backer was Andrew Mellon, who happened to be Secretary of the Treasury. His bank had provided the loans for DuPont's expansion. The connections were clear, documented, undeniable. So racism provided the emotional fuel, the public justification, the acceptable face of prohibition. And corporate interest provided the money, the political pressure, the machinery of legislation. Together they were unstoppable. The linguistic strategy was crucial. By calling it marijuana instead of cannabis, the prohibitionists created confusion, exploited ignorance, and hid the truth. When state legislators debated marijuana bans, most had no idea they were talking about cannabis, the medicine their constituents had been using safely for decades. When the American Medical Association finally realized what was happening, they protested vigorously. Dr. William C. Woodward, the AMA's legislative counsel, testified that cannabis was a recognized medicine, that marijuana was just a slang term for cannabis, that there was no evidence of danger or social harm. He accused the prohibitionists of hiding behind a foreign word to criminalize a safe and established medicine. His testimony was ignored. The truth didn't matter. The scientific evidence didn't matter. What mattered was the story, the narrative of foreign danger and racial threat. What mattered was the image of the crazed Mexican, the jazz musician, the outsider bringing corruption into decent American communities. Cannabis had been part of
American medicine and agriculture for centuries, but now it would be erased, redefined, transformed into something alien and evil. This is where the biography of cannabis splits. Hemp, the industrial crop, remained technically legal in most places, though its cultivation would be effectively destroyed by association. Cannabis, the medicine, would be removed from the pharmacopoeia, its medical use criminalized. And marijuana, this new identity, this foreign threat, would become the target of a prohibition movement that would eventually metastasize into the largest, longest, most expensive and destructive drug war in human history. But in the 1920s and early 1930s, this was still a local phenomenon, a border state panic, a regional prejudice. It had not yet become federal law. It had not yet become national policy. The transformation from local racism to federal prohibition required an architect, a true believer, a man willing to dedicate his career to the destruction of a plant. And then came a man who would turn this local panic into a federal crusade. His name was Harry Jacob Anslinger, and he would shape American drug policy for more than 3 decades. He would build the architecture of cannabis prohibition from the ground up. He would create the enforcement machinery, write the propaganda playbook, and weaponize the full power of the federal government against a plant. More than any other single person, Anslinger is responsible for the catastrophe that followed. In 1930, Anslinger was appointed the first commissioner of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He was 48 years old, a career bureaucrat who had spent the previous decade enforcing alcohol prohibition. He was a true believer, a moralistic zealot who saw the world in absolute terms of good and evil, purity and corruption. He believed in prohibition not just as policy but as moral necessity, as the government's duty to protect citizens from their own weaknesses. He was also ambitious, calculating, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. But in 1933, everything changed. Alcohol prohibition ended, the 18th Amendment was repealed, the grand experiment had failed, undone by impossible enforcement, rampant corruption, and overwhelming public opposition. The Bureau of Prohibition was dismantled, thousands of agents lost their jobs. Anslinger's world, his purpose, his career mission, had been legislated out of existence. Except that Anslinger had maneuvered himself into the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which handled opiates and cocaine. But these were established prohibitions, already managed by existing laws and treaties. There was little room for expansion, for empire building, for the kind of crusade that Anslinger craved. He needed a new enemy, a new threat, a new prohibition to justify his bureau's budget and expand his power. He chose marijuana. This was not based on evidence. It was not based on medical science or crime statistics or public health data. Anslinger himself had stated, just a few years earlier, that marijuana was not particularly dangerous and that its prohibition was unnecessary. But circumstances change. Political necessity overrides personal conviction. And Anslinger recognized that marijuana, already demonized in the Southwest, already associated with racial minorities and social outsiders, could be transformed into a national menace. He began collecting stories. He called them the Gore Files, a collection of newspaper clippings, police reports, unverified anecdotes, and outright fabrications that purported to document marijuana-induced violence and insanity. Most of these accounts were false or wildly exaggerated. Many came directly from the Hearst newspapers, which meant they were propaganda to begin with. Some contradicted basic facts or medical knowledge. None were subject to rigorous verification. But Anslinger didn't care about verification. He cared about persuasion. He testified before Congress with the passion of a preacher and the certainty of a prophet.
He told them that marijuana was the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. He presented cases from the Gore files as established fact. A man in Florida who smoked marijuana and killed his family with a max. A boy in Chicago who murdered his parents while high. A college student who became a homicidal maniac after a single puff. These stories were designed to terrify, to create images of uncontrollable violence lurking in every marijuana cigarette. The fact that they were unsupported, unverified, or simply false was irrelevant. They served their purpose. But the core of Anslinger's campaign was not violence, it was race. In private correspondence, in internal memos, in conversations with colleagues, Anslinger was explicit about his motivations. He wrote that reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. He claimed that marijuana caused white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. He described
jazz music, that great American art form born in black communities, as satanic, a product of marijuana use. His testimony before Congress stated plainly that there are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the United States, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. This was not subtext, this was the text. The explicit, documented, undeniable justification for federal marijuana prohibition was the threat that cannabis posed to white racial purity and social hierarchy. Anslinger targeted black jazz musicians with particular venom. He pursued Billie Holiday relentlessly, eventually contributing to her tragic decline and death. He harassed Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, and countless others whose only crime was musical genius and cannabis use. The Hearst newspaper empire became Anslinger's propaganda arm. His press releases were printed verbatim as news stories. His fabricated anecdotes became headlines. The symbiotic relationship was perfect. Hearst got sensational stories that sold papers. Anslinger got national media coverage that justified his budget and expanded his authority. Together, they created a moral panic from whole cloth. In 1936, the campaign reached its cinematic peak with a propaganda film titled Reefer Madness. Originally called Tell Your Children, the film depicted marijuana as a drug that caused immediate insanity, violence, and moral collapse. Clean-cut teenagers take a single puff and within minutes are committing murder, attempting rape, descending into psychosis. The film was funded and distributed with government cooperation, shown in schools and community centers as educational material. It was absurd, hysterical, wildly disconnected from reality, and it was effective. For decades, it would shape public perception of marijuana. In 1937, Anslinger got what he wanted. The Marijuana Tax Act passed through Congress and became federal law. Technically, the act didn't ban marijuana outright. Instead, it imposed prohibitively expensive taxes and impossible regulatory requirements on anyone who wanted to grow, sell, or use cannabis. Farmers had to purchase special tax stamps, but the government refused to issue the stamps. Physicians could prescribe cannabis, but only by navigating a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to discourage compliance. The effect was absolute prohibition dressed in the language of taxation. The American Medical Association opposed the act. Dr. William C. Woodward, the AMA's legislative counsel, testified before Congress that marijuana was simply another name for cannabis, a medicine that had been used safely for decades. He argued that there was no scientific evidence supporting prohibition, but the dangers were fabricated, that the legislation was unjustified. He accused the bill's supporters of deliberately using the term marijuana instead of cannabis to hide the fact that they were criminalizing a recognized medicine. His testimony was detailed, professional, scientifically grounded. It was completely ignored. The Marijuana Tax Act passed with minimal debate. Most congressmen had no idea what they were voting on. Some thought they were banning a dangerous Mexican drug they'd never heard of. Others assumed the medical community supported prohibition and never realized the AMA had testified against it. The process was quick, quiet, and deliberately opaque. The hemp industry was destroyed overnight. Farmers who had grown hemp for fiber couldn't afford the tax stamps or comply with the Byzantine regulations. Mills that processed hemp closed. Centuries of American hemp agriculture ended because it was botanically impossible to distinguish hemp from marijuana. They were the same plant, Cannabis sativa. The drug war claimed an industrial crop as collateral damage. Anslinger would remain commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics for 32 years, from 1930 to 1962. 32 years to build the enforcement infrastructure, to train a generation of agents in his ideology, to cement marijuana prohibition as unquestioned federal policy. He appeared before Congress more than 200 times, always advocating for harsher penalties, larger budgets, more aggressive enforcement. He shaped international drug policy, pushing other nations to adopt similar prohibition regimes. He transformed American law enforcement, creating the template for drug raids, no-knock warrants, and aggressive policing that would define the coming decades. His legacy is measured in ruined lives, in arrests that number in the millions, in families destroyed, communities devastated, an entire nation taught to fear a plant that had coexisted peacefully with human civilization for 10,000 years. Anslinger didn't create racism, didn't invent xenophobia, didn't discover propaganda, but he weaponized all. 3. With unprecedented efficiency. He understood that fear is more powerful than evidence, that repetition is more effective than truth, that moral panic can be manufactured and directed toward political ends. The plant itself remained unchanged. Cannabis grew as it had always grown, indifferent to human law, unaware of its new status as public enemy. But the story surrounding it, the meaning imposed upon it, the legal and cultural framework that defined it, all of that was Anslinger's creation. He took local prejudice and made it federal policy. He took racist propaganda and gave it the authority of law. He took a medicinal plant and transformed it into a weapon against the vulnerable, the different, the non-white. For a brief moment during World War II, the government needed hemp again, and the hypocrisy was laid bare. The war Nixon started didn't end with him. It metastasized into something far darker. But first, let's understand how we arrived at that war. How a plant that had been medicine, that had been rope and canvas and paper, that had been quietly used by millions without incident, became the centerpiece of a political strategy designed to destroy dissent and maintain power. The 1960s changed everything, not because the plant changed, not because new scientific evidence emerged, but because of who was using it. Cannabis became the symbol of counterculture, of rebellion, of a generation rejecting the values and wars of their parents. White middle-class college students, the children of privilege who were supposed to inherit the American establishment, were instead protesting the Vietnam War, growing their hair long, listening to rock music, and smoking marijuana. At the same time, the civil rights movement was evolving into Black Power, challenging not just segregation, but the entire structure of American racial hierarchy. Student activists were occupying buildings, burning draft cards, demanding fundamental change. This terrified the establishment, and Richard Nixon, elected president in 1968 on a platform of law and order, understood that this coalition of dissent, this alliance between white hippies and black radicals, represented a genuine threat to political power. But there was a problem. In America, you cannot make dissent illegal. You cannot arrest someone for opposing war. You cannot criminalize being black or young or politically radical. The Constitution, at least in theory, protects these freedoms. So they found another way. They would criminalize the cultural markers of dissent. They would target the substances and symbols associated with these movements. And marijuana, already demonized for decades, already carrying the weight of racist propaganda, already illegal in most states, was the perfect weapon. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, a comprehensive drug policy that organized drugs into 5 schedules based on their potential for abuse and accepted medical use. Nixon signed it into law. Marijuana was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs with high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. This category put marijuana in the same legal class as heroin. It deemed cannabis more dangerous than cocaine, more dangerous than methamphetamine, more dangerous than fentanyl. This classification was not based on science. It was not based on medical evidence. Decades of safe medical use were simply erased. The American Medical Association, which had opposed prohibition in 1937, protested again. They were ignored again. But Nixon, to his credit, or perhaps to provide political cover, did commission a comprehensive study. In 1972, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, known as the Schaefer Commission after its chairman, former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer, released its findings. The commission was stacked with Nixon appointees, conservatives and law enforcement officials who were expected to validate prohibition. They spent 2 years studying marijuana, reviewing scientific literature, examining criminal statistics, conducting surveys. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Marijuana did not pose a serious threat to public health or safety. The commission recommended decriminalizing purse-ball possession and use. They urged the government to stop arresting people for marijuana and instead treat it as a public health issue requiring education, not incarceration. Nixon rejected his own commission's findings. He buried the report, refused to implement its recommendations, and intensified enforcement instead. Because this was never about evidence. It was never about public health or safety. It was about power, control, and political warfare. In June 1971, Nixon held a press conference and declared drug abuse public enemy number 1. He called for an all-out offensive, a comprehensive attack on drugs that would require new laws, new agencies, new funding, and aggressive enforcement. He called it the war on drugs. The metaphor was deliberate. War justifies extraordinary measures. War suspends normal rules. War creates enemies and demands their destruction. And in this war, marijuana users, especially young white protesters and black activists, were the enemy. The federal enforcement machinery expanded exponentially. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs grew into the Drug Enforcement Administration in 1973. Budgets increased, agents multiplied. New laws granted police sweeping powers to search, seize, and arrest. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced, stripping judges of discretion and ensuring that drug offenses, even minor possession charges, resulted in prison time. The machinery of the carceral state, which had been building since Anslinger, accelerated into overdrive. But the full truth of Nixon's strategy would not be confirmed until decades later. In 1994, a journalist named Dan Baum interviewed John Ehrlichman, who had been Nixon's domestic policy advisor and one of the key architects of the drug war. The interview was recorded but not published for over 20 years until after Ehrlichman's death in 2016. What Ehrlichman admitted in clear and unambiguous language was the conspiracy behind the curtain, the calculated evil at the heart of prohibition. Baum asked Ehrlichman about the origins of the drug war, and Ehrlichman answered with stunning frankness. You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Read that again. Let it settle. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not speculation. This is documented confession from a man at the center of power, admitting that the drug war was designed from its inception as a tool of political repression. They knew marijuana was not dangerous. They knew prohibition would not reduce drug use. They knew they were lying, and they did it anyway, deliberately, systematically, because it was effective at destroying their political enemies and maintaining control. This is the truth that must be understood about cannabis prohibition. It was never about protecting children, never about public health, never about reducing harm. It was about criminalizing dissent. It was about disrupting black communities and anti-war movements. It was about giving police the power to harass, arrest, and imprison people whose real crime was political opposition. The plant was just the pretext. The arrests, the raids, the imprisonment, the destruction of lives and communities, all of that was the point. The counterculture had believed that marijuana was a symbol of freedom, of consciousness expansion, of peace and love. And in a tragic irony, they were right. It became a symbol. But the establishment understood symbols too. They understood that by criminalizing the symbol, they could criminalize the movement. By declaring war on a plant, they could declare war on a generation. Millions of young people, mostly white and middle class, were arrested for marijuana in the 1970s. Their lives were derailed, their futures compromised, their faith in the justice system shattered. But the real targets, the primary victims of this political warfare, were black communities. Because while white college students got arrested and released, black men and women went to prison. While white youth were slapped with misdemeanors, black defendants faced felony charges. The disparities were not accidental. They were the design. Nixon would resign in disgrace in 1974, brought down by Watergate, by his own paranoia and criminality. But the war he started continued. The enforcement machinery he built kept growing. The laws he signed remained in force. And every president who followed, Republican and Democrat alike, would embrace and expand the drug war, each adding their own chapter to the catastrophe. The war Nixon started didn't end with him. It metastasized into something far darker. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan took the drug war that Nixon had declared and transformed it into a national obsession. His wife, Nancy Reagan, launched the Just Say No campaign, a simplistic slogan that reduced complex social issues to a failure of individual willpower. But behind the friendly face of First Lady moralism, the machinery of enforcement was being rebuilt into something unprecedented in American history. The Reagan administration passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. These laws judges of discretion, forcing them to impose harsh prison terms, even for minor, non-violent drug possession. A person caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine received the same 5-year mandatory minimum sentence as someone caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine. This 100-to-1 sentencing disparity was not accidental. Crack was associated with black communities, powder cocaine with white professionals. The racism was built into the arithmetic. 3 strikes laws follow in the 1990s, mandating life sentences for third-time offenders, even if all 3 offenses were nonviolent. A man could receive life in prison for 3 marijuana possession charges. Life for a plant. The consequences were catastrophic. Let's talk about numbers. By 2010, marijuana arrests in the United States reached their peak, 850,000 arrests in a single year.
That's one arrest every 37 seconds. Every day, every hour, around the clock, someone in America was being arrested for marijuana. 88% of these arrests were for simple possession, not distribution or sale. People holding small amounts for personal use, people who posed no threat to anyone, were being handcuffed, processed through the criminal justice system, and given criminal records that would follow them for life. The racial disparities are stark, undeniable, and shameful. Black Americans are arrested for marijuana possession at 3.7 times the rate of white Americans. Not because Black people use marijuana more. Study after study, survey after survey, shows that marijuana use rates are roughly equal across racial groups. White Americans use marijuana at similar or even slightly higher rates than Black Americans, but Black Americans are arrested far more often. In some counties, the disparity reaches 10 to 1, 20 to 1. This is not accidental. This is not coincidence. This is the drug war functioning exactly as it was designed to function, targeting specific communities for social control and political suppression. Arrest is just the beginning. An arrest record, even without conviction, creates barriers. A conviction creates walls. A felony conviction creates a cage that exists outside of prison, because once you have a felony drug conviction on your record, you enter a permanent underclass. You check the box on every job application. Most employers won't hire you. You're barred from public housing. You're ineligible for federal student loans, cutting off access to higher education. In many states, you lose your right to vote, your ability to participate in democracy. You cannot get professional licenses. You cannot qualify for many jobs. You are marked, stigmatized, legally discriminated against for the rest of your life. Families are destroyed. A father arrested for marijuana possession loses his job. Without income, the family loses their home. Children are placed in foster care. The mother, now a single parent struggling with housing instability, may turn to survival strategies that put her at risk of arrest. The cycle compounds. One arrest creates cascading consequences that ripple through generations. Children who grow up with incarcerated parents are more likely to drop out of school, more likely to experience poverty, more likely to be incarcerated themselves. This is not metaphor. This is documented social science, the measured impact of prohibition on human lives. By the 2000s, the United States had the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher than authoritarian regimes, higher than military dictatorships, higher than any nation in human history. 2.3 million people in cages, millions more under probation or parole supervision. And a significant percentage of this mass incarceration, this American gulag, was driven by drug offenses, with marijuana as a primary contributor. Communities were gutted. In some neighborhoods, an entire generation of Black men cycled through the criminal justice system. The social fabric was shredded. Trust in police and government collapsed. The damage was comprehensive, intentional, and catastrophic. But the destruction wasn't confined to American cities. Prohibition creates black markets. When you criminalize a substance that millions of people want to use, you don't eliminate demand. You simply hand the market to criminals. And marijuana prohibition created a black market worth over $40 billion annually. That money flows somewhere. It flows to criminal organizations, to cartels, to networks built on violence and corruption. Mexican drug cartels, which began as small-scale marijuana smuggling operations, grew into paramilitary organizations with revenues exceeding many national budgets. They control territory, they wage wars, they torture and kill with industrial efficiency. And marijuana, which Americans like to think of as a peaceful drug associated with hippies and relaxation, funds much of this violence. The Sinaloa cartel, the
Zetas, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, these organizations made billions from marijuana smuggling. They used those billions to buy weapons, bribe officials, and murder rivals. Between 2006 and 2020, conservative estimates suggest that over 150,000 people were killed in Mexico's drug war. Mass graves were discovered containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. Journalists who reported on cartel violence were assassinated. Politicians who opposed the cartels were beheaded, their heads displayed as warnings. Entire towns were terrorized, forced to choose between collaboration and death. And much of this violence, this industrialized killing, was funded by American marijuana prohibition. Because when something is illegal, the people willing to trade in it are the people willing to use violence to protect their market. Think about the absurdity, the cruelty, the tragic waste. Marijuana has never caused a fatal overdose. Not one. Not in 10,000 years of human use. Alcohol kills 95,000 Americans every year. It destroys livers, causes car accidents, fuels domestic violence. It's sold in every grocery store, advertised during football games, completely legal. Tobacco kills 480,000 Americans annually. It causes cancer, heart disease, emphysema. It's taxed and regulated, but freely available. Marijuana's annual death toll from overdose is 0. Yet for this plant, we built a war that imprisoned millions, destroyed communities, and funded international violence on a staggering scale. Let's be precise about what prohibition accomplished. It did not reduce marijuana use. Studies consistently show that marijuana use rates are determined by cultural factors, not legal status. States with harsh penalties don't have lower use rates than states with decriminalization. Countries with prohibition don't have significantly different use patterns than countries without it. Prohibition did not protect children. In fact, illegal markets don't check ID. It's often easier for teenagers to buy marijuana than alcohol, precisely because marijuana dealers don't care about age restrictions. Prohibition did not reduce addiction. The small percentage of users who develop problematic use patterns need treatment, not incarceration, and prohibition makes it harder for them to seek help without risking arrest. What prohibition did accomplish was suffering. It created millions of arrests. It filled prisons. It gave police tools for harassment and control. It created a massive illegal market that funded violence and corruption. It destroyed families, communities, and lives. It deepened racial inequality. It eroded trust in government and law enforcement. It cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. And it didn't stop marijuana use at all. This is the true cost of prohibition, not measured in dollars, that the financial waste is staggering, measured in human lives, measured in children who grew up without parents, measured in people who spent years in cages for possessing a plant, measured in Mexican farmers who were tortured and killed by cartels fighting over drug routes, measured in communities that never recovered from the systematic removal of their young men into the prison system, measured in the lie that was told over and over that this was necessary, that this was justice, that this was keeping anyone safe. The war was never about the plant. The plant is just a plant. The war was always about us, about power, about control, about who gets punished and who gets protected. But in the shadows of this war, a quiet resistance was growing. In the darkest years of the drug war, when the machinery of enforcement seemed unstoppable, when arrests happened every 90 seconds and prison populations metastasized, something unexpected began to emerge, not from politicians or policy experts, not from scientists or reformers working within the system, but from the dying. The 1980s brought a plague that the world had never seen before. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, ravaged communities, particularly gay men in cities like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles. The disease destroyed the immune system, leaving the body defenseless against infection. But it was the wasting syndrome that often killed first. Patients lost weight rapidly, unable to eat, racked by nausea, their bodies consuming themselves. The medications, what few existed, brought their own torments: chemotherapy-level nausea, debilitating side effects. Many patients simply stopped eating, stopped fighting, and waited to die. Then some of them discovered something that the federal government had spent decades insisting had no medical value whatsoever: marijuana. A few puffs, and suddenly, impossibly, they were hungry. The nausea receded. They could eat. They could gain weight. They could fight a little longer. Word spread to the community, quietly at first, then louder.
Classified as Schedule I, no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse, was keeping people alive. In San Francisco, a man named Dennis Perone watched his partner die of AIDS. He watched him waste away, watched him suffer, and he watched marijuana give him relief when nothing else could. Perone was an activist, a Vietnam veteran, and a cannabis advocate who had been fighting prohibition for years. In 1992, he did something revolutionary. He opened the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, a place where AIDS patients could obtain marijuana openly, in defiance of federal law. It was civil disobedience of the most profound kind, not violent protest or symbolic resistance, but practical compassion, a place where the dying could get medicine. And he was not alone. There was a woman named Mary Jane Rathbun, though everyone called her Brownie Mary. She was a volunteer at San Francisco General Hospital, a grandmother in her 60s who spent her time with AIDS patients in the final stages of the disease. She baked brownies, hundreds of them. Brownies infused with marijuana, which she distributed to patients who were too weak to smoke, too sick to eat, too far gone for conventional medicine to help. She was arrested, multiple times, faced jail, prosecution, the full weight of the drug war apparatus. She was in her 70s by then, a frail elderly woman whose crime was baking brownies for dying young men. And she never stopped. "I'd rather go to jail," she said, "than let them suffer." She became a folk hero. The image was too perfect, too damning for the drug warriors to spin. A grandmother facing prison for easing the suffering of AIDS patients. It revealed the cruelty at the heart of prohibition, the government's own moral bankruptcy. The government's response was telling. In 1978, they had created the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, a small provision that allowed a handful of patients with severe medical conditions to receive marijuana legally from the federal government. Actual joints, grown at a federal facility, delivered in metal tins. Proof that the government knew marijuana had medical value, despite Schedule I classification. By 1992, as applications flooded in from AIDS patients, the government closed the program to new patients. 13 people continued to receive federal marijuana until their deaths. Everyone else was left to break the law or suffer. The movement grew.
It wasn't just AIDS patients anymore. Cancer patients discovered that marijuana-controlled chemotherapy-induced nausea better than any pharmaceutical. Veterans with PTSD, returning from the Gulf War and earlier conflicts, found that marijuana quieted the nightmares, eased the hypervigilance, allowed them to sleep. They self-medicated and faced prosecution. Their own government, which had sent them to war, now threatened them with prison for treating their war wounds. Then came the children. Parents watching their sons and daughters suffer from intractable epilepsy, conditions like Dravet syndrome that caused hundreds of seizures per week. Watching them seize so frequently that normal life was impossible, that brain development stalled, that every day was a battle for survival. Traditional medications failed or brought intolerable side effects. Desperate, some parents discovered CBD, cannabidiol, a non-intoxicating compound in cannabis, and saw miracles. Charlotte Fiji was 5 years old, experiencing nearly 300 seizures per week. Nothing worked. Her parents, as a last resort, tried CBD oil derived from a specially bred cannabis strain. Within weeks, her seizures dropped to 2 or 3 per month. She could play, she could learn, she could live. The strain became known as Charlotte's Web. Her parents became activists, joining the thousands of others who had moved from patients to protesters, from victims to advocates. They were not criminals. They were parents fighting to keep their children alive. By the mid-1990s, the medical marijuana movement had reached critical mass. In California, activists gathered signatures for Proposition 215, a ballot initiative that would legalize marijuana for medical use under state law. The federal government opposed it. Law enforcement opposed it. The pharmaceutical industry opposed it. But on November 5, 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215 by a margin of 56 to 44%. It was the first crack in the wall. For the first time since Prohibition began, marijuana was legal, even if only for medical use, even if only in one state. Patients could grow their own. Caregivers could provide it. Doctors could recommend it without fear of losing their licenses. The federal government did not surrender quietly. The DEA continued raids. Federal agents stormed dispensaries, arrested providers, seized plants. It didn't matter that these operations were legal under state law. Federal law superseded state law, and under federal law, marijuana remained Schedule 1. Patients found themselves
in legal limbo, protected by state law, hunted by federal agents. The fear was constant. But the wall had been breached. Within a few years, other states followed. Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Maine. Medical marijuana laws spread through ballot initiatives and legislative battles, state by state, year by year. Each victory partial, each law contested, but the direction undeniable. This was grassroots resistance at its most powerful. Not policy papers or think tanks, but ordinary people risking prison to ease suffering. Grandmothers baking brownies, parents treating their children, veterans healing their wounds, activists opening buyers' clubs. They faced the full machinery of federal prohibition, the DEA, the courts, the prisons, and they did not blink. They proved that the plant had medical value, despite decades of government denial. They demonstrated that compassion was a stronger force than enforcement. They showed that the drug war, for all its power, could be resisted. And then, slowly at first, then all at once, the wall began to crumble. On November 6, 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington state did something that had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They voted to legalize marijuana for recreational use, not medical necessity, not compassionate exceptions, full legalization. Adults could possess it, consume it, grow it. Businesses could sell it. The state would regulate and tax it like alcohol. It was a direct challenge to federal prohibition. The Controlled Substances Act still classified marijuana as Schedule 1. The federal government still insisted it had no medical value, high potential for abuse, no acceptable use under medical supervision. The drug war was still official policy. And yet 2 states, sovereign entities within the federal system, simply said no. We will not arrest our citizens for this anymore. We will not enforce your war. The dominoes began to fall. Alaska and Oregon in 2014, California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada in 2016. By 2024, 24 states had legalized recreational marijuana. 38 had medical programs. The majority of Americans now lived in places where cannabis was legal in some form. The unthinkable had become mundane. Dispensaries with sleek interiors and professional branding appeared on street corners. Tax revenue flowed into state coffers, billions of dollars annually. The plant that had been demonized for nearly a century was suddenly legitimate. But victory, when it came
carried a bitter taste. The legal cannabis industry exploded. Within a few years, it was projected to become a multi-billion-dollar market. And where there is profit, capital flows. Wealthy investors, venture capital firms, corporate entities, they descended on the emerging industry with extraordinary speed. Massive grow operations, sophisticated distribution networks, professional marketing campaigns. This was big cannabis, and it looked nothing like the underground economy it replaced. The executives, the entrepreneurs, the investors featured on magazine covers and in business profiles were overwhelmingly white, wealthy, well-connected. Many had never touched marijuana until it became legal, had never risked anything, had never suffered under prohibition. They simply had capital, and capital buys access. The irony was grotesque. For decades, the drug war had devastated black and brown communities. Millions arrested, families destroyed, wealth stripped away, lives derailed. And now that the same plant was legal, those communities were largely excluded from the profit. The people who had paid the highest price were shut out of the gold rush. Social equity programs were created, ostensibly to address this injustice. States designed licensing systems that gave preference to applicants from communities disproportionately harmed by prohibition. People with prior cannabis convictions, residents of heavily policed neighborhoods. The intention was reconciliation, to allow those who suffered to participate and benefit from the legal market. But intention and reality diverged sharply. The legal cannabis industry required capital, enormous amounts of it. Licensing fees, real estate, inventory, legal compliance, security systems, testing facilities. Starting a dispensary could require hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. And because marijuana remained federally illegal, banks, federally regulated institutions, could not service cannabis businesses. No business loans, no lines of credit, no traditional financing, cash only. So who could afford to enter the market? The same people who always had capital. Wealthy investors, established business owners, those with access to private wealth or venture funding. Meanwhile, those with prior cannabis convictions, the very people social equity programs were designed to help, faced additional barriers. Criminal records made securing capital nearly impossible. Regulatory complexity required expensive lawyers and consultants.
The application process itself was Byzantine, designed by and for people with resources. The result was predictable. The legal cannabis industry became dominated by those who had never suffered prohibition's consequences. The wealth gap, already vast, widened further. A white entrepreneur could open a gleaming dispensary and make millions selling the exact same plant that a black man was serving a decade-long sentence for possessing. And those sentences continued. In 2024, more than 40,000 people remained incarcerated in the United States for marijuana-related offenses. Federal prisons, state prisons, county jails. Their crimes? Possession, distribution, cultivation. Acts that were now legal in half the country. You could walk into a dispensary in Denver, purchase an ounce of marijuana legally, and drive past a prison holding someone whose life was destroyed for selling a quarter ounce in 1998. The federal government had not surrendered. Marijuana remained Schedule I. Federal prohibition continued unchanged. The consequences rippled outward in unexpected ways. Immigrants, even legal permanent residents, faced deportation if they worked in state legal cannabis businesses. Federal employment was closed to anyone who used marijuana, even medicinally, even in legal states. Veterans could not receive medical marijuana through the VA, despite state legality, because the VA was federally funded. Interstate commerce remained illegal. Crossing state lines with marijuana, even from one legal state to another, was a federal crime. The contradictions were everywhere. Legal storefronts operated openly, generating tax revenue, creating jobs, serving customers, while just blocks away, people sat in cages for doing the same thing without a license. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Some states attempted to address the injustice through expungement programs, clearing criminal records for marijuana offenses that were no longer crimes. California launched an initiative to automatically expunge hundreds of thousands of convictions. Other states followed. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, incomplete. Many people eligible for expungement never received it because they didn't know about the program, couldn't navigate the paperwork, or lived in jurisdictions that moved glacially. And even when records were cleared, the years lost could not be restored. The time in prison, the jobs never obtained, the education interrupted, the families fractured. Expungement could erase the conviction, but it could not erase the consequences. Those with felony records face barriers even in legal states. Many licensing systems prohibited people with certain criminal histories from participating in the industry. Background checks, disqualifying offenses. Ironically, some of the people with the deepest knowledge of cannabis cultivation and distribution, those who had operated in the illegal market for years, were legally barred from the industry they had helped create. The banking crisis persisted. Legal cannabis businesses operated almost entirely in cash. Millions of dollars flowing through storefronts with no bank accounts, no credit card processing, no traditional financial infrastructure. It created security risks, tax complications, and opened opportunities for money laundering and theft. Some banks began quietly servicing cannabis businesses, hoping federal enforcement would look the other way. But the risk remained.
At any moment, federal authorities could seize assets, prosecute bank executives, shut down operations. The legal landscape became a patchwork of contradictions. In some places, marijuana was fully legal. In others, possession meant prison. Crossing an invisible state border could transform a legal purchase into a federal crime. The same substance, the same plant, carried wildly different consequences depending on geography. The drug war had not ended. It had simply become localized, inconsistent, and more confusing than ever. This was the great reversal. After nearly a century of prohibition, of propaganda, of arrests and imprisonment and destruction, marijuana was becoming legal. But legalization did not mean justice. It did not mean reconciliation. The people who profited were not the people who had suffered. The industry was legal, but tens of thousands remained in prison. The laws had changed, but the inequality, the racial disparity, the wealth gap, those remained. You could buy marijuana legally in a gleaming dispensary, while the person who sold it to you last year sat in a cage. You could invest in a cannabis company and become wealthy, while communities devastated by prohibition remained locked out. You could celebrate legalization, while someone faced deportation for working at a grow operation. Legalization was not the ending of the story. It was simply another chapter, one without clear heroes, without neat resolution, without the justice that millions had fought for. The plant was no longer criminal, but the systems
that had weaponized it, the inequalities it had been used to enforce, the damage it had inflicted, those persisted. So here we are, in 2024, in the strange twilight between two worlds. America exists in a state of profound legal contradiction, a nation halfway free, traits oils, pay with cash, receive a receipt, and walk out into daylight with fear. In 26 other states, possession of that same product means arrest, prosecution, a criminal record. The difference is geography, an invisible line that transforms legality into criminality, freedom into felony. But even in legal states, the contradictions multiply. Federal employees cannot use marijuana, not medicinally, not recreationally, not even in states where it is fully legal. They are subject to drug testing, and a positive result means termination. It doesn't matter if they never used while on duty, never impaired their performance, never violated state law. Federal law supersedes everything, and federal law says marijuana is Schedule 1, illegal, dangerous, unacceptable. Military personnel face the same restrictions, with even harsher consequences. A soldier stationed in Colorado, where marijuana is legal, cannot consume it even off-duty, even off-base. To do so risks court-martial, dishonorable discharge, the loss of benefits earned through years of service. Veterans who served their country, who carry the physical and psychological scars of war, cannot legally use marijuana through the VA, even when state law permits it, even when it is the only thing that quiets the nightmares. Those who require security clearances face their own barriers: defense contractors, intelligence analysts, federal agents. Marijuana use, even in legal states, even years in the past, can disqualify applicants or result in clearance revocation. The government's message is clear: we do not trust you if you have used this substance, regardless of what state law says, regardless of medical need, regardless of context. Athletes, too, remain trapped in prohibition's machinery. The NCAA suspends student athletes for marijuana use. The NFL, until very recently, penalized players severely. Olympic athletes have been stripped of medals for testing positive, even when marijuana was legal in their home states, even when they used it for pain management or anxiety. The rules written decades ago, when marijuana was universally prohibited, persist as the world around them transforms. Perhaps the cruelest contradiction is in medical research. Marijuana remains Schedule 1, which by definition means it has no accepted medical use. But how does a substance gain accepted medical use? Through research, clinical trials, peer-reviewed studies. The FDA requires extensive evidence before approving any medication. But Schedule 1 classification makes research extraordinarily difficult. University researchers need DEA approval, a process that can take years and is frequently denied. They must obtain marijuana from a single government-approved facility that produces cannabis far inferior to what is available commercially. The studies are limited, underfunded, constrained by bureaucratic barriers at every turn. It is a perfect catch-22. The FDA says marijuana cannot be rescheduled without research proving medical efficacy. The DEA makes that research nearly impossible, and so the cycle perpetuates. Meanwhile, other nations, Israel, Canada, the Netherlands, have conducted decades of research, building substantial bodies of evidence that marijuana has genuine medical applications. America, which once led the world in medical research, lags behind because of its own prohibition. The international implications are equally absurd. For decades, the United States enforced global marijuana prohibition. The UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, signed in 1961, required member nations to criminalize cannabis. America used diplomatic pressure, foreign aid conditions, and economic leverage to ensure compliance. Nations across the world criminalize marijuana not because of their own research or cultural values, but because the United States demanded it. Now those nations watch, bewildered, as American states legalize marijuana while federal prohibition remains.
Canada fully legalized cannabis in 2018, becoming the first major industrialized nation to do so. But crossing the border from Canada into the United States with marijuana, even a single joint, remains a federal crime. The same country that pressured the world to prohibit now exists in legal schizophrenia, unable to reconcile its own laws with its state policies. The banking crisis continues unresolved. Legal cannabis businesses generate billions in revenue. They employ tens of thousands of people. They pay state taxes, local taxes, licensing fees, but they cannot access federal
Banking systems, no checking accounts, no business loans, no credit card processing. They operate almost entirely in cash, millions of dollars flowing through dispensaries, transported in armored vehicles, stored in vaults, creating security risks and opportunities for theft. It is prohibition by another means. The businesses are legal, but the infrastructure to support them is not. States collect taxes on federally illegal sales. Colorado, Washington, California, they have generated billions in marijuana tax revenue. They fund schools, infrastructure, drug treatment programs with money earned from a substance the federal government insists is dangerous and without value. The absurdity is complete. The government profits from the same activity it criminalizes. This is America in 2024, a nation where you can legally purchase marijuana while someone sits in federal prison for selling it, where states run billion-dollar legal industries while the federal government maintains that the plant has no accepted medical use, where you can be a legal cannabis entrepreneur in California but face federal prosecution if you transport your product to Nevada, where research that could save lives is blocked by the very agencies tasked with protecting public health. The drug war has not ended. It has simply become more contradictory, more absurd, more impossible to justify. We exist in the liminal space between prohibition and legalization, between past and future, between the lies we were told and the truth we are slowly, painfully discovering. And so we return to where we began, to the question of what this plant really is. Strip away a century of propaganda, remove the lies told by Harry Anslinger, the fear stoked by Richard Nixon, the mythology built around rad madness and moral panic. Take away the laws, the arrests, the prisons, the entire machinery of prohibition. What remains? A plant, ancient, resilient, complex. Cannabis contains more than 100 distinct chemical compounds called cannabinoids. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is the primary psychoactive compound, the molecule that produces the sensation of being high. CBD, cannabidiol, is non-intoxicating but has demonstrated therapeutic properties for pain, inflammation, anxiety, seizures. The chemistry is intricate, the effects variable depending on strain, dosage, method of consumption, and individual physiology. It is not harmless, this must be acknowledged. Cannabis can affect developing brains. Adolescents who use heavily may experience impacts on memory, learning, and cognitive development. For some individuals, marijuana triggers anxiety, paranoia, or in rare cases, acute psychotic episodes. Heavy, prolonged use can lead to psychological dependence. People can develop a reliance on marijuana to manage stress, sleep, or emotional regulation. The dependency is real, though it differs fundamentally from physical addiction to substances like opioids or alcohol. But here is the data that cannot be ignored. In all of recorded history, there has never been a documented death from marijuana overdose, not one. It is pharmacologically impossible. The cannabinoid receptors in the human brain are not located in regions that control respiration or cardiac function. You cannot consume enough marijuana to stop your heart or shut down your lungs. The lethal dose, in theory, would require ingesting thousands of times the amount needed to achieve intoxication, an impossibility in practical terms. Compare this to substances that are legal, socially accepted, commercially available. Alcohol kills approximately 95,000 Americans every year through overdose, accidents, liver disease, and related causes. Opioids, both prescription and illicit, claim roughly 80,000 lives annually. Tobacco causes 480,000 deaths per year in the United States alone. These are substances that society has deemed acceptable, that are advertised, sold openly, integrated into cultural rituals. Marijuana, by any objective pharmacological measure, is orders of magnitude less dangerous. 0 overdose deaths per year. 0. And yet it was classified Schedule 1, more dangerous than cocaine, more restricted than methamphetamine, deemed to have no medical value whatsoever. The danger was never pharmacological, it was always political, racial, economic. The plant did not change over the past century. Cannabis in 1937 was the same species as cannabis in 2024. Its chemical properties remained constant. What changed were human laws, human fears, human power structures. We decided the plant was dangerous. We decided who would be punished for using it. We decided which communities would be terrorized, which lives would be destroyed, which families would be broken. And now we are deciding to reverse course. But reversal is not justice. Legalization does not erase the past. More than 40,000 people remain incarcerated in American prisons for marijuana offenses. Millions more carry felony records that bar them from employment.
Housing, education, civic participation.
Entire communities were devastated by decades of aggressive enforcement. Wealth extracted, families separated, trust in institutions shattered. And now those same communities watch as predominantly white entrepreneurs profit from legal cannabis industries, appearing on magazine covers, celebrated as visionaries. Justice requires more than changing laws. It demands expungement, clearing the records of those convicted of offenses that are no longer crimes. It demands reparations, material acknowledgement of the harm inflicted, resources directed to communities that suffered most. It demands an honest accounting of what was done and why, and who benefited from the suffering. The question extends beyond marijuana. Will we learn from this history, or will we repeat the same patterns with other substances, other communities? Already, conversations about psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, ayahuasca, are beginning. Research suggests therapeutic potential for PTSD, depression, end-of-life anxiety, but the pattern is familiar. Early medical use, cultural adoption by marginalized communities, criminalization, decades of prohibition, slow reversal as white, wealthy advocates champion decriminalization. The machinery is the same, only the substance changes. Can we break the cycle? Can we address drug use and public health without criminalization, without targeting the vulnerable, without building empires of enforcement that serve power rather than safety? Can we acknowledge complexity, that substances carry risks, that some people will struggle, that harm reduction and treatment are more humane and more effective than punishment? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers. They demand choices. Somewhere right now, cannabis is growing. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where it has grown for millennia, in the illegal gardens of rural America, in the massive legal grow operations of Colorado and California, in ditches and backyards and remote forests across the world. The plant is indifferent to human drama. It does not know that wars were fought in its name, that millions were caged because of it, that fortunes were made and destroyed. It simply grows, as it has for 10,000 years, wild and resilient and unconcerned with the meanings we impose upon it. We carry the weight. The plant knows nothing of guilt or innocence, justice or revenge, freedom or captivity. It grows in silence while we decide what to do with the history we created, while we determine what we owe to those we caged, to the communities we ravaged, to the children of prohibition who inherited a world shaped by lies. The ending is not written. It never was. The question remains open, suspended in the space between what we have done and what we might yet become. And so we reach the end, though the story continues. Right now, as you listen, laws are still changing, legislatures are still debating, people are still sitting in prison cells for a plant that is legal 100 miles away. Activists are still fighting. Communities are still healing or trying to. The dispensaries are still open, the arrests are still happening, and the contradictions remain unresolved. History does not end cleanly. It does not wrap itself in a bow and present neat conclusions. It simply continues, flowing forward, carrying us with it whether we pay attention or not. Thank you for staying, for listening, for bearing witness to this long, tangled, difficult history, for following the thread from ancient hemp fields to modern dispensaries, from sacred rituals to racist propaganda, from Anslinger's lies to today's incomplete legalization. It is not an easy story. There are no clear heroes, no simple villains, no moment when justice arrives and makes everything right. There is only the messy, complicated reality of human choices and their consequences. But here is what matters. Memory is a form of resistance. To remember what was done, and why, and who paid the price. That is to refuse the comfort of amnesia. Amnesia is what allows us to repeat our mistakes, to criminalize the next substance, to target the next community, to build the next machinery of enforcement and call it justice. Memory keeps us honest. It demands that we face what we have done and ask whether we will do better. If you learned something tonight, if this history meant something to you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more hidden histories, for the stories we do not tell ourselves, for the truths that live in the gaps between official narratives. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The algorithm rewards engagement, and engagement determines who else finds these stories. But more than that, think about what you will do with this knowledge. History is not just what happened. It is what we remember and what we choose to do with that memory. It is a question we answer with our actions, our votes, our voices, our choices about what kind of world we want. Build. Let these questions drift with you now, into sleep. Let them rest gently at the edges of consciousness, not demanding answers, but simply present. The world will still be here in the morning. The questions will remain. The work of justice, always unfinished, will continue. Rest now. You have listened well. You have carried this story with me to its end, or perhaps to its pause. Sleep with the knowledge that history is not destiny, that change is possible, that the choices we make matter. The plant still grows. The questions remain. And we, all of us, carry the weight of what comes next. Sleep now. The story continues.